For centuries, the most learned men on Earth looked up at the sun and saw a mirror. They believed that the heavens were constructed of the familiar, that the fiery heart of our star was built from the same heavy, reliable elements as the ground beneath their feet: iron, silicon, aluminum. It was a comforting arrogance. It suggested that the universe was just a larger version of our own backyard, understandable, tangible, and earthly. This was the consensus. This was the dogma. And in the dusty halls of academia in the early 1920s, to suggest otherwise was not just incorrect, it was scientific heresy. But history has a way of hiding its revolutions in the unlikeliest of places. While the titans of astronomy were busy confirming their own biases, a 25-year-old doctoral student was sitting alone in a room at Harvard, staring at glass plates that held the ghosts of starlight, preparing to dismantle their entire reality. Her name was Cecilia Payne. She had left England because there was no future there for a woman who wanted to be more than a teacher or an assistant. She came to the Harvard College Observatory, a place that was simultaneously progressive and deeply archaic. It was a place where women were employed as computers, human calculators meant to catalog data, not interpret it. They were expected to be diligent, precise, and silent. But Cecilia was looking for the noise in the data. She was armed with a weapon that the older generation of astronomers barely understood: the emerging chaotic science of quantum mechanics. While the establishment looked at the spectral lines of stars, those tiny barcodes of light that reveal chemical composition, and saw only what they expected to see, Payne saw the raw, terrifying truth. She applied the ionization theory of Indian physicist Meghnad Saha to the spectral classes of stars. It was a mathematical deep dive that no one had attempted with such rigor before. As she crunched the numbers, aligning the temperature of the stars with the absorption lines on the photographic plates, a picture began to form that was completely alien. Her calculations were relentless. They didn't show a universe made of Earth stuff. They didn't show iron and silicon as the primary ingredients. Instead, the data screamed a single impossible fact: hydrogen. According to her math, hydrogen wasn't just present, it was the dominant building block of the cosmos, 1,000,000 times more abundant than the established models predicted. Helium, too, was vast and overwhelming. If Cecilia was right, the universe wasn't heavy and solid. It was light, gaseous, and burning with a fuel that the scientific patriarchs had dismissed as a minor trace element. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated discovery, the kind that happens once in a millennium. She had unlocked the recipe of the stars. She had found the fuel that lights the galaxy. It was 1925, and she had just written what astronomers would later call the most brilliant PhD thesis ever written in astronomy. But in that moment of triumph, the shadow was already looming. Because truth, no matter how mathematically pure, is dangerous when it threatens the reputations of powerful men. Cecilia Payne had found the secret of the universe, but she had forgotten that she was living in a world owned by men who preferred their own comfortable lies. The tragedy of scientific history is often not that the truth is hidden, but that it is silenced by those sworn to protect it. When Cecilia Payne prepared to publish her thesis, Stellar Atmospheres, she wasn't just presenting data, she was presenting a new cosmology. But before her voice could reach the world, it had to pass through a gatekeeper. Enter Henry Norris Russell. In 1925, Russell was not merely an astronomer, he was the astronomer. He was the director of the Princeton University Observatory, a man whose name was synonymous with the stellar evolution theories of the day. He was the dean of American astronomers, a figure of immense gravity and unshakable authority. His word was law, and his law stated unequivocally that the sun and the earth were chemically identical. When Payne sent her draft to Russell, she was likely hoping for validation, perhaps even mentorship from the great man. Instead, she received a verdict that would haunt the rest of her life. Russell read her conclusions about the overwhelming abundance of hydrogen and recoiled. To him, the data was not a revelation, it was an error. It contradicted the established wisdom of the ages. It contradicted his wisdom. He wrote to her with the patronizing weight of the entire establishment behind his pen that her results were clearly impossible. He argued that the dominance of hydrogen was a delusion, likely a flaw in her application of the theory or an artifact of the equipment. Imagine the position of Cecilia Payne. She was a young woman in a field where women were barely tolerated as equals. She was a doctoral student standing before a god of her industry. To push back would be professional suicide. To insist that she was right and the great Norris Russell was wrong would be seen as arrogance, perhaps even madness. The pressure was suffocating. She trusted her math, but she was forced to mistrust her own reality. The system was designed to make her doubt. And so the capitulation happened. It is one of the most painful sentences to read in the history of science. In her final thesis, the very document that proved she had solved the riddle of the stars, Cecilia Payne inserted a disclaimer. She wrote that her calculated abundances for hydrogen and helium were almost certainly not real. With those 4 words, she disowned her own discovery. She was forced to categorize the fundamental truth of the universe as a mistake. It was a forced confession, coerced by the sheer weight of authority. Russell didn't have to rewrite her paper. He simply made her kill the soul of it. She published the data, but she buried the conclusion. She deferred to the wisdom of her superior, protecting his ego at the cost of her legacy. The world continued to believe the lie because the woman who knew the truth had been bullied into calling it a falsehood. It was an act of intellectual violence, quiet and polite, executed with a fountain pen in the margins of a manuscript.
The irony of suppression is that the truth eventually surfaces, but rarely with the name of the person who first found it. 4 years passed. 4 years of the scientific community operating under the false assumption that stars were made of iron. 4 years of Cecilia Payne working, observing, and knowing deep down that she had broken the code, yet remaining silent because the gatekeepers had told her to be. Then, in 1929, the gatekeeper changed his mind. Norris Russell, the very man who had crushed Payne's discovery, began to conduct his own research into the composition of the sun. He used different methods, different approaches, but the universe, indifferent to human politics, gave him the same answer Payne had found years earlier. Russell realized that the sun was, in fact, almost entirely hydrogen. The impossible was suddenly possible because he had decided it was so. In a twist that history often reserves for the privileged, Russell published his findings. In his paper, On the Composition of the Sun's Atmosphere, he declared the abundance of hydrogen to be the great revelation of the age. To his credit, he did mention Payne. He cited her earlier work in the body of his text, a brief nod to the woman he had silenced. But the narrative had already been written. Because Russell was the authority, the discovery became his. The Russell mixture became the standard term for the composition of stars. The scientific community, eager to celebrate one of their own patriarchs, attributed the breakthrough to him. For decades, textbooks and lectures solidified this theft. Generations of astronomy students learned that Norris Russell discovered that stars are made of hydrogen. Cecilia Payne watched from the sidelines. She continued her work at Harvard, a giant among pygmies, yet she struggled for basic recognition. It wasn't until 1938 that she was even granted the title of astronomer. Before that, she was merely a technical assistant. It took until 1956 for her to become the first female professor and the first woman to head a department at Harvard. She fought for every inch of ground she stood on. Today, we try to scrape away the layers of historical revisionism. We try to give the name back to the discovery. We now know that Cecilia Payne Gapashkin was the one who saw it first. She was the one who looked into the heart of the sun and didn't blink when the data contradicted the world. But we must never forget the cost. We must never forget the 4 years of delay, the sentence she was forced to write, and the credit that was stripped from her. Her story is a reminder that science is objective, but scientists are not. It is a memorial to all the truths that were branded impossible simply because they were spoken by the wrong voice. The universe is made of hydrogen. This is the secret she whispered to us, even when the world ordered her to be silent.